Well, it's really great to be here, and I'd like to thank you for the very warm welcome I've received. Thank you, Professor Dugan. Thanks especially to Father Brian Jordan, who does so much to bring the Franciscan vision to the life of our city, for inviting me. And as a lifelong Brooklynite, I've always liked St. Francis College, but in recent years, as I've worked in academia myself, I've really come to appreciate even more what you do here. So I'm especially delighted to be part of your celebration of St. Clare and St. Francis Week. As a Franciscan school, you have the ability and mission to bring the vision of St. Francis to bear on the issues of our time. Today, I'll discuss one way St. Francis has shown us how to do that, through a notable episode of his life, his encounter with the Sultan of Egypt, Sultan Al-Kamil, on the banks of the Nile in 1219 during the Fifth Crusade. And before I get started, I'd like to do something a little different. I've spoken on the book many times, but I've never done it this way, which is to play a song for you by a folk rock band called the Kennedys. Do any of you know that group? A few of you, good. And it's called Stand. It was released in 2003. So I'll just ask you if you could follow the words, and then I'll explain later why I've asked that it be played. I found myself listening to this song a lot when I was writing the book. You know, you're just sitting by yourself at home all day long. And I first heard it on WFUV radio, and that line, "Come on and stand, plant your sword in the sand," just jumped out at me. So did one other line, Allah Buddha Yahweh, Jesus Brahma, people get ready. And I'm going to focus on both of those lines today. When Francis went into the Crusader camp in 1219, he actually had the courage to preach to the soldiers essentially the words we hear in this song, "Plant your sword in the sand." Those are not easy words to say to a group of soldiers who were primed for combat. A little background first. By the time Francis went to Egypt, the Crusades had been fought for about 120 years, on and off. The Crusaders initially conquered Jerusalem. In 1187, the Muslims, led by the great warrior Saladin, took it back. Francis was about 5 years old at that time, and so was the future Sultan Al-Kamil, who was actually the nephew of Saladin. For the rest of these little boys' lives and decades after, various crusades were launched with the aim of winning back Jerusalem. The plan for the Fifth Crusade was to conquer Egypt as a step toward conquering and securing Jerusalem. After the war was well underway, Francis arrived on the scene and took it on himself at some point to cross enemy lines and seek out the Sultan whom he wanted to convert. He didn't succeed in converting the Sultan, but he did win the Sultan's respect, and he was permitted to preach for several days before being sent back to the Crusader camp with a military escort. And think for a moment how amazing that is, that the Muslim leader allowed him to preach the Christian faith in the middle of the crusade. Francis was deeply affected by his encounter with the Sultan and with Islam. When he came home, he wrote a new rule for his order that urged its members to live peaceably among Muslims and be subject to them. He wrote this even while the crusade was continuing, at a point when Christians had reason to believe they could win the war. His was a revolutionary approach. The Sultan, for his part, made numerous attempts to achieve a peace treaty. He ultimately won the war, and then he shocked the Christians with the kindness he showed them. Those are the basic facts. I've interpreted Francis's journey as a mission of peace because, as I argue, Francis quietly opposed the crusade and sought to end the war by converting the Sultan to Christianity. I think both men can serve as useful models for us today. Francis, because he recovered the Christian traditions of nonviolence, of befriending enemies, and of skepticism for warfare. The Sultan, because he reflected Islamic traditions, including respect for Christian holiness, and because of and also his constant pursuit of alternatives to war. The Crusaders' plan was first to conquer the city of Damietta, which was a walled, fortified city at the mouth of the Nile. And then they were going to advance down the Nile to seek to conquer all of Egypt. When Francis arrived at the scene, Damietta was under siege. It was a siege that would ultimately cause the death of nearly all of the 80,000 people in the city due to disease and starvation. In brutal battles, thousands of soldiers were dying on both sides. One question historians have often debated is whether Francis opposed the crusade. I argue that he did. Those who are engaged in Franciscan studies know that although there are quite a few medieval accounts of Francis's life, they're not always factually reliable. They're not written as history would be today. And the idea that Francis approached the Sultan in a spirit of peace would have been a very touchy one in the 13th century when the popes were trying to rally public support for a series of crusades that were terrible failures. The historical debate about Francis's view of the crusade focuses on a passage in an account written in 1247 by Friar Thomas of Celano, who was the Franciscan order's first official biographer of Francis. He'd written an earlier version about Francis about 2 years after Francis died in 1226, so maybe you can consider this version in 1247 the sequel. It has an interesting scene in which Francis becomes anguished the night before a planned attack, and he believes that God has warned him the attack will fail. So he goes over and talks about it with an unnamed brother. Francis says, "If the battle happens on this day, the Lord has shown me that it will not go well for the Christians. But if I say this, they will take me for a fool, and if I keep silent, my conscience won't leave me alone. What do you think I should do?" The brother responds, "This wouldn't be the first time people took you for a fool. Unburden your conscience and fear God rather than men." So Francis preached vigorously against the battle, taking the risk he would be considered a security threat. Thomas of Celano wrote, "The saint leaped to his feet and rushed to the Christians, crying out warnings to save them, forbidding war and threatening disaster. But they took the truth as a joke. They hardened their hearts and refused to turn back." That's where I see that line from the song coming in. "Come on and stand, plant your sword in the sand." That's really what Francis was saying there, and that's why that song jumped out at me so much when I heard it on WFUV. What Francis got back was a chorus of insults. But when Francis spoke to the soldiers, was he forbidding war, or was he merely opposing battle on this day? The two phrases, both there in print, seem to contradict each other. I do think I write a lot about this in more detail in the book, but I do think it's worth noting that Thomas of Celano was writing in Latin. He had Francis forbidding bellum. I'm no Latin person, but Latin scholar, but he could have used the word pugnum, or battle. Still, historians are really divided on this passage, and in the end, I thought it was prudent to step back a little bit, and I decided the way to search for an answer was to look at the larger context. Who was Francis, and what motivated him? And when you do that, the inescapable conclusion is that Francis was forbidding war. That is, he was opposing the crusade. To understand what drove Francis at this key moment, we need to go back to the story of his conversion. And I just have a few slides I'll show you. Certainly the image of Francis that I grew up with is that he was a man of great piety who felt God's presence in nature. Jim Ballard, my classmate from grade school, we saw a movie about Francis at Mary Queen of Heaven, right? It was something that was part of our education. And of course, we think of Francis as an animal lover. So here's just a few slides. That's in Gubbio, the Wolf of Gubbio. And very famous painting by Bellini captures Francis in nature with the stigmata. And I think this image that I grew up with about Francis is pretty much, it's true. I'm not saying it's false, but we need to know more about him. The larger picture of Francis is that he had been traumatized by his devastating experience as a young man, as a soldier and prisoner of war. It's hard for us to imagine Francis carrying a sword or a lance, but he was in fact a cavalryman, a knight, for his town of Assisi in a battle against much more powerful neighboring town, Perugia. And in this battle, he saw his friends massacred and hunted down like animals. Then he suffered a year in a dark underground prison of sorts in Perugia. He was a shattered man by the time his wealthy father was able to ransom him. And I went and looked at the battlefield when I was in Assisi, and it's probably not the place people usually go when they travel to Assisi, but I found it a very important place because I think it really helped to shape who Francis was. So here's a few photos of that. This, if you've been to Assisi, you recognize the Rocca, the castle that's over the town. That was the imperial castle. The merchants of Assisi, Francis was from, his father was a leading merchant, was so angry at the imperial authorities and at the aristocrats that they tore this castle down completely. It was only rebuilt later, but so that's what's on the site. So here is the hill of Calistrata. This is where the battle is fought. It's between Assisi and Perugia. It's off the Tiber River. It's on Assisi's side of the river, but Perugia laid claim to the land even so. Judging from that sign today, who do you think won the battle? Right, Perugia, okay. After Francis was taken prison on that battlefield, he was marched over a bridge that was on this site. The actual bridge Francis was taken over was there until not that long ago, but it got flooded. So this is a new bridge. And he was thrown in this deep, dark hole. They didn't have prisons as we would know them today at that point of the 13th century. They did develop later in the 13th century, the kind with bars and all that. So the hole was under this Renaissance era building. And there were like these ancient Etruscan ruins and just these deep crevices in the rock. And today there's shops there. So, well, there's also a big shopping mall by Calistrata. But you can go in an elevator down into the underground to see these shops. And it goes down 4 floors. So it was a deep pit in the ground. And Francis underwent this experience. He spent a year in this dark underground cell. Now, Francis was a traumatized veteran. I interviewed a U.S. Army expert on the psychology of war who taught at West Point, and he told me that based on what we know from the different chronicles that I described to him, Francis would certainly have suffered serious survivor guilt because, you know, all the people he knew were killed, and he was spared because his father was well off. And that a year in the sensory deprivation of an unlit underground jail would be enough to shatter any human being. Whatever he, meaning Francis, went in there with, he would have left fundamentally a changed human being. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman told me that as an instructor at West Point, he taught students about a U.S. flyer who was tortured as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. What the flyer talked about most upon his release was what it was like to be deprived of light. It's devastating. Francis was a shattered young man, and that's reflected in the early chronicles by Thomas of Celano. When he eventually recovered, he did try once more to go to war, this time to fight in southern Italy in a war between the Pope and the Emperor's forces. On the way, he became increasingly anxious, and after a dream, he turned back and began the conversion process. Once Francis recovered from his trauma, assisted by intense solitary prayer, he eventually adopted a radical, countercultural lifestyle that made it impossible for him ever to go to war again. Let me see if I have other photos of that. This is a famous dream of Francis, okay? He's seeing this beautiful building filled with these gleaming weapons. You see there's the shield with the cross on it, a Crusade symbol. This is the only art I've seen of Francis as a soldier. It's a modern sculpture outside the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. And here he's coming home, kind of dejected. He's ready to change his life. okay? He's given up. This is the second time when he was going to go back into the military. He's giving up at this point, coming home. This is a place where it's believed that Francis prayed in solitude, okay? It was a cave, and now there's I guess a church, you could call it, a hermitage and church that's built there. It's about 2 miles up the hill from the town of Assisi. And if you go to Assisi, I heard that some of you will be going shortly, I would definitely go to the spot. That's the church there. Now, the historian Lauro Martinez once observed, too often in the 13th century Italian city, doing the restrained or peaceful thing would have required the renunciation of self-identity. In other words, it was so violent that, and you were so wrapped into it, that the only way out of it would be to totally renounce who you were. Otherwise, to take your place in society, you had to take part in this warfare. He wasn't referring to St. Francis when he said this, but that observation really tells the story of his conversion. In medieval times, people were expected to take oaths of loyalty that committed them to fight whenever they were called on. So without a radical change in his life, Francis, it would have been impossible for a young merchant such as Francis to avoid being drawn into the violence again and again. So one of the things Francis did when his movement began was to forbid his followers to swear oaths, which was a pretty radical and daring step at the time. Francis, as we know, began to repair churches. That was a way that military men atoned for their sins on the battlefield. As he wrote shortly before his death, a key turning point in his life came when he worked up the courage to kiss a leper. As a result of his radical lifestyle of peace, poverty, and penance, Francis was attacked in the streets, beaten up by his father and others, and he submitted willingly because he had adopted nonviolence as the only sane response to the violence that had dragged him down in the past. For quite a few years, Francis and his followers faced violence and other persecution. It's easy to forget how provocative his lifestyle was. Even to sympathetic outsiders, let's see, maybe a few more photos. Okay, this is the famous scene where Francis is kind of renouncing his father, handing over his clothes, and the Bishop of Assisi sort of protecting his modesty, but also I think maybe taking him under his wing there. Even to sympathetic outsiders like the Bishop of Assisi, the severe life that Francis seemed to exult in seemed insane. The Bishop of Assisi once told him, "It seems to me that it is very hard and difficult to possess nothing in the world." It made absolute sense to Francis. He said, "My Lord, if we had any possessions, we should also be forced to have arms to protect them. Since possessions are a cause of disputes and strife, and in many ways we should be hindered from loving God and our neighbor. Therefore, in this life, we wish to have no temporal possessions." This quote is key to understanding Francis's conversion. He was keenly aware that voluntary poverty distanced him from the military life that nearly destroyed him and was killing many others. Francis could plainly see that the greed dominating the society around him was directly linked to the pervasive violence. It was violence based on economic disagreement between the merchant class and the aristocrats. He wanted no part of it. Francis is famous for his poverty, but we need to recognize that his poverty directly connected to his peacemaking. Now, Francis adopted a greeting that was very unusual for that time. "May the Lord give you peace." He said God told him to use this greeting, and in that era, that violent era, this greeting bothered people. A brother told Francis that people greeted in that manner would ask indignantly what this greeting of yours meant. The brother explained to Francis that this embarrassed him, and he asked his permission to use a different greeting. Francis responded, "Let them chatter, for they do not understand the ways of God. Don't feel ashamed because of this, for one day the nobles and princes of this world will respect you and the other friars for this greeting." The story ended with a remark from Francis about how the little people were close to God. The people who didn't understand were the nobles and princes of the world, that is, the lords of war. Peacemaking was central to Francis's ministry. There are stories of his specific intervention in warfare in Arezzo, which is the artwork you see represented in the artwork behind me, Bologna, Siena, and Perugia. They show that at the core of his being, Francis was repulsed by war. He transformed his entire life to escape what it had done to him. Faced with the extreme violence that Francis saw in Damietta, his natural response was to urge that any further warfare be avoided. Francis was always on a mission of peace. He didn't turn that off when he went to Egypt. So I think the scene in which he preaches against the battle has to be seen in that context of his opposition to the war. Another question I examine in the book is whether Francis would have supported the crusade out of obedience, because Francis's writings do put a great emphasis on obeying church authorities, even when they might not deserve the obedience. But for Francis, there was always a higher authority, God. He put his conscience first, and he instructed his brothers that there were times when they might have to disobey a church authority. So I do think that Francis opposed the crusade and that his journey to the Sultan's court can be called a mission of peace. One of the strongest pieces of evidence to me is what's missing from the accounts of his life. And if this were a detective story, you would say it's the dog that doesn't bark. There's no hint that he ever preached the crusade, even though his patrons in Rome were very strong supporters of it. The early accounts of his life, especially those written either on a commission from a pope or under a pope's influence, would definitely have mentioned this, because these popes were big advocates of the crusade. Francis didn't speak out against church authorities. It wasn't really his style. He wanted to be obedient and humble. So he preferred to teach by example. He was really a performer by nature. As a young man, before his military service, he had been considered, I guess, kind of the life of the party. Now, we often remember him now for the kindness he showed to animals, but we don't necessarily see all that he was driving at. His outrageous acts of compassion for lambs being led to slaughter, hooked fish, birds, worms he found on the street, were a kind of performance meant to shock human beings into loving one another. I think he liked animals too, but I think he was up to something more. Thomas of Celano commented on this in his ancient account. Imagine how much love he had for human beings, since he showed so much compassion for animals. Francis often tried to create what I call tableau of peace, to shock people into loving one another. For example, he told his friars to treat a band of dangerous robbers with love and respect by offering them bread and wine, which, according to the early accounts, helped to shock them into changing their lives. Francis disliked all contentiousness, probably because he saw what it led to in Assisi's war with Perugia. So he usually avoided denunciation. In this era, church officials were very upset about a heretical movement called the Cathars. One of Pope Innocent III's 3 disastrous crusades is called the Albigensian Crusade, a bloody war against these people in southern France. In the same period, the Inquisition just began to take shape. Francis, as far as we know, didn't denounce the Cathars or preach against them in the way that perhaps St. Dominic was known for. But look at what he did. While the Cathars taught that the material world was evil, Francis embraced nature and saw God's goodness in it and in all God's creatures. While the Cathars rejected the Church's teaching on the Eucharist, Francis went out of his way to be very devoted to the Eucharist. Francis taught through example, and sometimes through extreme examples, a kind of performance designed to shake people up. Francis's unarmed trip to the Sultan was also a kind of performance, a shocking display of nonviolence in the midst of war. After the Christians lost the big battle that Francis had spoken against, the Sultan made a new peace offer that involved his willingness to turn over Jerusalem to the Crusaders. The leader of the crusade, Cardinal Pelagius, was a hardliner who turned down the Sultan's peace proposals and pushed the troops further and further into Egypt, despite warnings by his top general, the dashing French nobleman Jean de Brienne, that it was a mistake. Jean de Brienne wanted to accept the peace offer. That's the point when Francis decided he wanted to take the risky step of visiting the Sultan unarmed. So he went, despite Cardinal Pelagius' objections. Well, the cardinal eventually said, all right, but if you get killed, it's not my fault. And what about the Sultan? He really was an extraordinary figure and a model worth remembering today. Egyptian Christians see him as the most tolerant, sultan Egypt ever had. One time, for example, he intervened in a dispute over proposed construction of a mosque on the site of a church. Some Muslims insisted there was once a mosque on the site, giving them a right to build a new one. Sultan Al-Kamil went out to inspect personally and found no sign that there had ever been a mosque there, and he actually ruled in favor of the Christians and took some heat for that. He also tried to avoid the Fifth Crusade by opening trade relations with the West. And during the war, he repeatedly made offers that were rejected, peace offers that were rejected by Cardinal Pelagius. There's only one Western biography of the Sultan, published by a German scholar, H.L. Gottschalk, in 1958. It calls him a statesman, and I think it's true because he did rule very adeptly for 40 years, first as viceroy and then as sultan. I once read that Osama bin Laden called his fighters descendants of Saladin. But as I said, Sultan Al-Kamil really was a descendant of Saladin. He was his nephew, and his faith led him to respect Christians and to avoid warfare when possible. After much uncertainty, Sultan Al-Kamil triumphed in the Fifth Crusade. At first, the Crusaders conquered Damietta. Their behavior there so distressed St. Francis that he went home. Then, urged on by Cardinal Pelagius, the army pushed too far into Egypt and didn't know the terrain. The Sultan's troops were able to trap the Crusaders up to their waists in mud and water by using sluice gates to raise the level of the Nile. The Crusaders were surrounded by a larger army. Their supply lines were cut off, and they were waist deep in muck. At that point, they asked the Sultan for peace. The Christians were stunned when Sultan Al-Kamil not only spared their lives, but gave them food and transportation. Again, as a wise leader, Sultan Al-Kamil knew it was best for everyone to make peace rather than seek vengeance. It was in his interest to get the opposing army out of his country as soon as possible, but those who wanted to take revenge, he didn't listen to. One of the architects of the crusade, a future cardinal, later wrote that the Sultan truly deserved the name Kamil, which means perfect. I think the key to understanding the Sultan is that he knew his own religion and acted on it. The Sultan was influenced by Sufism, which is a mystical approach to Islam. He loved the Sufi poets. He was devoted to the teachings of a great Sunni scholar of the law, Imam al-Shafi, and he built a beautiful dome over the Imam's tomb in Cairo. He built religious schools, and I have a few photos of those. That's the citadel, which is still there in Cairo. The Sultan was the first Sultan to live there. It's a big castle. This is the Nile near Damietta. This is the dome that he built over the tomb of Imam al-Shafi. It's a very beautiful spot in Cairo. This is part of a complex of a school that he built. And there's a Western depiction of the Sultan. Some of the medieval accounts imply that he secretly wanted to be a Christian, but his actions show him to be a good Muslim. The Quran speaks warmly of holy Christian monks. It says their eyes brim with tears at the mention of God's name, and thus the Sultan showed great respect for Francis. Now, the medieval accounts don't give us all that much detail about what Francis said during the several days he was with the Sultan and his followers, but given the length of time he stayed, it is obvious he was respectful of Muslim beliefs, even as he explained his own. We have to assume that Francis used his customary greeting of peace, which he always used. This would set the tone. Francis announced himself as an ambassador of Christ rather than of the Crusade authorities. It can't be denied that Francis was there to convert the Sultan, which today would hardly be the way to begin what we now call interreligious dialogue. Right? As you know, it's an understatement. But we have to remember that in Francis's day, the concept didn't exist in any way that we understand it now. I interviewed a leading scholar of Islam, Syed Hossein Nasser, who, in addition to being an important professor on that subject in the U.S., is very involved in the Catholic-Muslim dialogue through the Common Word Initiative. And in fact, when the Muslim scholars the 138 Muslim scholars gathered to meet with Pope Benedict, he was the spokesman in their behalf to speak to Pope Benedict. So I asked Dr. Nasser about this, and he said that what's significant here isn't that Francis was interested in converting the Sultan because it could have happened no other way. What he felt was important was that Francis had approached the Sultan with no hint of coercion, entirely in peace. As some historians note, before the Crusade, Pope Innocent III had sent a letter to the Sultan's father inviting him to convert to Christianity. But that was much different. That letter was more of a threat than an invitation, because the Pope informed the Muslim leader that this time God was on the Christian side and they were going to win the war. So that's really not what I would consider a real attempt to convert somebody. Anyway, Francis's approach to Muslims was nothing like that at all. He was unarmed, and so was his rhetoric, which I think is important. This made Francis such an appealing figure to Dr. Nasser that he actually visited La Verna to pray there. That's the place of Francis's most intense spiritual experience. Anyway, unlike many other people at the time, as far as we know, Francis never spoke in a disparaging way about Islam or Muslims. In wartime, the enemy is often demonized, and there was a lot of Crusader rhetoric on record in which Sultan Al-Kamil is labeled a cruel beast, as Professor Dugan said, and was likened to images of evil from the Book of Revelation. Francis did not do that. With that said, I'd like to go back to another line from the song Stand. Allah Buddha Yahweh, Jesus Brahma, people get ready, there's a train that's coming. Many different legends, just one story, all aboard the train that's bound for glory. Although respectful of people who held other beliefs, Francis would not have taken the point of view that all the religions were just one story. He believed wholeheartedly in the Christian faith, just as Sultan Al-Kamil believed wholeheartedly in the Islamic faith. Yes, there are some similarities between the two religions, and maybe that's one reason the Sultan was interested in hearing Francis preach. But they're also different, and I think part of the magic of the encounter between the Sultan and Francis is that despite this difference, and despite the war going on around them, they still respected each other. Those involved in Franciscan studies know it's not easy to extract historical facts from the early biographies of Francis, since, as I said, they're not really written as history in the sense we would know it today. So how can we understand what happened between Francis and the Sultan? There are major discrepancies among the 15 or so medieval accounts. I deal with this in more detail in The Saint and the Sultan, but just want to say for our purposes that in general, I relied on the earliest accounts, which were written by a French bishop who was on the Crusades, Jacques de Vitry, future cardinal. They depict the encounter between Francis and the Sultan as a peaceful one, as does the earliest work of art, which is on the cover of the book. It dates to about 1245. Let's see. That's a statue of Francis that's in downtown Cairo at a Franciscan church there. So here's that art. It's in the Basilica of Santa Croce, if I remember right, and it's on a panel painting. So there are other pictures around a central image of Francis. And you see from that, it's pretty much as Jacques de Vitry said in his early account. He had written a letter home describing this unusual thing he had heard about Francis and the Sultan. A couple of years later, he did a book that was sort of a world history, but he had a little section again on this. So he was the closest in time to what happened and the closest in place also. And as you see, the artwork here, it's entirely peaceful. Francis is speaking, people are listening to him. But there was an account written about 40 years after the fact in St. Bonaventure's major legend of St. Francis. And that portrays a much more confrontational Francis who challenged the Sultan's religious advisors to a trial by fire. So there's two versions. They're both attributed to the famous Renaissance artist Giotto, or Giotto if you prefer, and they're from around the year 1300. And I believe this is the one that's, if you go to Assisi and you go to the Upper Basilica, there's this amazing cycle of paintings of Francis's life. I believe that this is the one that's there. Now, did Francis go in and challenged the Sultan's advisors to walk through fire and see who came through in better shape to reveal the truth about what had happened. I reject this for many reasons. One of them is that the church held a major council in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council. Francis was very attuned to its edicts, and it banned trial by ordeal. And Francis was not one to violate such clear church edicts. Also, it conflicts with the Francis we meet in his own writings, where he emphasizes loving the enemy. There was a young German theologian who did his doctoral thesis on called Bonaventure's The Theology of History in St. Bonaventure. His name was Joseph Ratzinger. And he says that Bonaventure's portrait of Francis may be more a work of theology than of history. It's a beautiful, shining portrait of Francis, especially for devotional purposes. But I think there's a lot of reasons not to accept his account of this event as historical. Anyway, the major legend of St. Francis was made the order's official account of Francis's life. I think we'll save it for those who might want to read the book. But there was St. Bonaventure really saved the Franciscan order. There was a huge heresy scandal, and the order had some very serious enemies, especially in the major universities, who were eager to take advantage of the scandal. Bonaventure recast Francis in a much more obedient and less quirky and less fun way than the earlier accounts. And part of that, I think, was to portray Francis as kind of a warrior here in this scene. What happened in 1266, the order decided it wanted to put all this trouble behind it, and part of that was that it ordered the destruction of all the previous accounts of Francis' life. Thankfully, a few copies were found here and there of these manuscripts in the monasteries of other orders. So we still have them, and they really fill out our picture of Francis a lot. Anyway, I don't think that this was historical, and even if you accept what Bonaventure wrote as historical, there was not actually any fire. The Sultan said, no, we don't want to do that. So, but you know, it was very visual, so we have the fire. Then there's this other painting. This dates to 1452. Giotto's work inspired a lot of other versions, so here's one of many. Here we have a painting from 1452, and if you think back on your history, that's just before the year Constantinople fell, right? So it's a time of renewed tension, again, between Christians and Muslims. And this painting is by Benozzo Gozzoli. And in it, you do see the fire, right? I believe Francis is not only in front of the fire, but in the fire in this painting. And you see that blonde-haired woman kind of waving at him. And this is actually a totally separate story that emerged about 100 years after Francis died. There was a short period when Francis, after Damietta was conquered, he was in the city, this devastated city, and that a woman tried to seduce him. The medieval document calls her a certain woman who was very beautiful in face and body, but very foul in mind and soul. According to this story, Francis took off his clothing and lay in the fire in her fireplace as if it were a bed, showing her the error of her ways. So in this painting, the artist has kind of taken the liberty of combining these two events in one painting. And the inscription on the painting says that the Sultan used the woman to try to tempt Francis. So now, I just told you a few minutes ago, in real life, the Crusaders gave a glowing account of Sultan Al-Kamil. They were amazed at his goodness. But we see that as the years passed, the Sultan was being portrayed in Christian art as this really smarmy, immoral villain. So I guess, we could say that maybe Francis didn't accomplish that much through his dangerous journey to the Sultan's camp. The war continued, and Christian-Muslim relations continued along badly. But I like to think that some of the seeds Francis planted did indeed sprout, and that perhaps some more still will. In recent years, the Franciscan order in particular has rediscovered this story and it has inspired the Franciscans and others to engage in peacemaking. When I went to Assisi, I spoke to one priest there who, inspired by the story in the 1980s, with other friars, had separate meetings with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to try to convince them to see each other as human beings before they met for any kind of diplomatic negotiations. I know I just read a couple of years ago that Gorbachev prayed at the tomb of Gorbachev, the communist, prayed at the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi. I was in touch with a Franciscan priest from South Africa who had sent teams of friars all over Africa to mediate and avert various conflicts. He too was inspired by this story. So what lessons can we draw as we mark St. Clare and St. Francis Week in Brooklyn? First of all, as I note, that Francis never demonized those he didn't know. He disarmed his rhetoric. Francis was persistent. He had this belief that it was possible to speak to Muslims, and it took 3 journeys for him to succeed in that. The first time he went to Spain, was planning to go through to Morocco. He didn't go. The second time he had to turn back because of a huge storm at sea. So there's always going to be obstacles for us. Francis was courageous. He risked his life. A quote from Gandhi says, "Nonviolence cannot be taught to a person who fears to die." I don't think Francis wanted to die a martyr when he went to the Sultan, but he was willing to risk it. I think peace is made at one person at a time. That's part of what this story it tells us. And that's something we can all participate in. Francis acted on his own. He didn't wait for the leadership to act. I'm not advocating that you board a plane to negotiate with Iran's Revolutionary Guard, but all of us meet people of many different backgrounds, and those interactions offer us a chance to create good feelings or bad ones, to contribute to tensions or to ease them. At some point, maybe the opportunity will come for you to cross the battlefield as Francis did. I'm not necessarily talking about the kind of battlefield he crossed with body parts, dead horses, scorched earth. I'm talking more about the cultural battlefield. There will always be memories of past disputes and outrages, whether you're dealing with differences in religion, race, nationality, or other cultural conflicts. Another aspect we see in both Francis and the Sultan is the great courtesy and respect they showed one another. When Francis addressed the Sultan, he started out by saying, "If you wish to hear me," and that word "if" is very significant. Civility is always important. Both Francis and the Sultan were open to the unexpected. It would have been easy for the Sultan to take one look at Francis and the friar with him, Illuminato, and throw them both into jail as prisoners of war. Instead, he listened to them. The experience of Francis and Damietta also shows us that for all of our effort, we can't expect immediate results. Francis's proposal to live peacefully among Muslims failed to catch on, at least immediately. The years after he returned home from Egypt were very difficult for him, a time when he was put on a pedestal as a living saint, but became frustrated that no one was listening to him. The Crusades continued for the rest of the 13th century, long after Francis died. He didn't stop the bloodshed. And yet, with the Kennedys, we can ask, can we walk together the winding road up to the rising sun? Here we are talking about his encounter with the Sultan 800 years later. Francis of Assisi planted seeds for better relations between Christians and Muslims, and even in our own age of unreason, they're starting to sprout whenever we tell the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that magnificent lecture. It was outstanding. We have 2 respondents to this wonderful lecture. These are members of our Muslim Student Society, and their coordinator for the society, the moderator, is Professor Ghazala Afzal, who will go first to be a respondent, be followed by one of the leaders of the Muslim Student Society, Miriam Hallam, who will also follow Dr. Ghazala. This need to connect the past and the present for this important dialogue at this time. But first, without further ado, Professor Ghazala Afzal.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Father Brian, Ms. Agler, President Dugan, thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts on the saint and the Sultan. If I pronounce it, it's out of habit. because that's how the word is pronounced in Arabic, Sultan. Professor Moses, thank you for undertaking this tremendous project and reaffirming for many of us that hope is not a futile dream in this age of tremendous strife and suspicion between our two faiths. Those of us who are incurable optimists will find validation in your retelling of St. Francis' story, a story that can sustain us despite our fears, our anxieties about the direction the world is seems to be headed in, with the hope that the sanity will prevail upon our decision makers on both sides of the divide. I turn to the saint and the sultan. I feel that the two men at the center of this story were destined to meet. How else do you explain St. Francis waiting for 7 years to have just those few days, few hours, maybe 2 days with the sultan? He undertook 3 perilous journeys, which in the 13th century were no mean feat. Add to this the possibility, in view of the advice and warnings he received, that he would lose his life at the hands of a very cruel man, Sultan Al-Kamil, the man he wished to convert. Martyrdom may well have been a much desired goal for the religiously committed. However, it still is in many cases, but the lives of St. Francis and his companions have proved much more significant and influential to humanity than his death would have been. The fact that St. Francis was received cordially, honored, feted, and escorted back to the boundaries of Christian camp in safety does not surprise me at all. Note that all this happened in the absence of any diplomatic channels and international laws that would have hold any party accountable for any unsavory incident. Just a few hours or days of interaction between the two were enough to make a lifelong impression on St. Francis and build an atmosphere of mutual respect and understanding that can still inspire anyone who loves and follows St. Francis of Assisi. I propose to explain how this may have come about. I turn to the Holy Quran for an answer. You're familiar with all those passages, albeit quoted out of context most of the time, that speak negatively of other faiths, including Christianity and Judaism. But I'm going to quote only 2 passages from the Holy Book that may explain what the Sultan and the theologians or other scholars at his court would already know. Says Allah in chapter 3 about Christians, لِيَسُوءُ سَوَاءً مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ أُمَّةٌ قَائِمَةٌ يَتْلُونَ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ وَهُمْ يَسْجُدُونَ. Translation, yet all are not alike. Among the people of the book, there are upright people who recite the messages of Allah in the watches of the night and prostrate themselves in worship. They believe in Allah and in the last day and enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong and hasten to excel each other in doing good. These are among the righteous. This is from the 3rd chapter, verses 113 and 114. Further, in another ayah, which is a verse, يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهُونَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَيُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. Says Allah, and there are certainly among Jews and Christians those who believe in God, in the revelation to you and in the revelation to them, bowing in humility to God. They will not sell the signs of good for a miserable gain. For them is a reward with their Lord. verse 199. Most Muslim theologians believe that a good Muslim has to be a good Jew and a good Christian first. I propose to explain how this may have come about. With all this discussion, add to this the common knowledge amongst Muslims that the first person to recognize and acknowledge Muhammad, peace be upon him, his prophethood was his wife's cousin, a much respected, highly revered Ebonite priest in Mecca named Waraka ibn Nawfal. It's falling, I think. Ebonites were a Jewish Christian sect that regarded Jesus as the Messiah, just like Muslims, but did not accept his divinity. Waraka died a Christian, yet remained a staunch supporter of the Prophet till his own death. According to one hadith, which is an authentic saying of the Prophet, "Do not slander Waraka ibn Nawfal, for I have seen that he will have one or two gardens in paradise." Also known to Muslims, and this is common knowledge, is the story of Abdullah ibn Salam, a Levite Jewish priest, one of the most pious men in Yathrib. He had recognized Muhammad, may peace be upon him, as a divine messenger immediately after the Prophet arrived in his city, after his migration. Abdullah ibn Salam did convert, or as the Muslims believe, revert to Islam, but he was the first person promised paradise amongst all the companions of the Prophet. He was the first promised paradise by the divine revelation. Many Quran scholars believe that the Holy Book is speaking of him when it refers to the children of Israel, testifying to the divine message in chapter 46, verse 10. Say, have you considered if the Quran was from Allah and you disbelieved in it, while a witness from the children of Israel has testified to something similar and believed while you were arrogant? Indeed, Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people. Although it is not uncommon for Muslims or their rulers to disengage with the teachings of the Prophet and the divine book and follow their own ambitions and their own prejudices, but when examining an event of this nature, a meeting between a king and a saint that takes place in a very charged, very hostile environment with very unexpected consequences, one tries to seek a rationale for it. Sultan Al-Kamil's respectful, even cordial relations with Christians of Egypt, with Christians of Jerusalem, had perhaps prepared Al-Kamil for this meeting. Perhaps the two men recognized each other as servants of God, fulfilling their own mission on this earth. From the moment salams or greetings were exchanged, a rare spiritual connection must have been established. We may never know exactly what was said and done in this historic meeting, and the hagiographers and the artists may continue to insert their own readings, their own ideas in the lives lived 8 centuries ago. But for those who believe in giving peace a chance, perhaps it is sufficient to know that one of the greatest saints in Christian history had wanted no bloodshed in the name of religion. Ironically, one of the greatest achievements of the saint's life was covered up, by more powerful narratives in keeping with the politically motivated campaign. In this magnificent moment of the meeting between the Sultan and the saint, we have an ideal and inspiring meeting of the East and the West, of Islam and Christianity, and of humility and nobility sans arrogance. As Paul Moses reiterates, The saint and the sultan became men of the moment, and the remaining trajectory of the saint's life shows the deep impressions he brought back with him from Egypt. In St. Francis' early life, I saw parallels to Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, and the lives of many other Muslim saints. Just like people would throw rocks and mud at him early in his spiritual career, as did they treat the Prophet, and never did either entertain a thought of giving up their mission. Just as St. Francis suffered indignities and imprisonment at the hands of his father, so did the early converts to Islam. St. Francis' younger brother taunted him mercilessly about his calling. One of the Prophet's uncles tortured him so much that the uncle's name became synonymous with persecution. Also, just as Bishop Guido covered St. Francis' exposed body to comfort him, the Prophet's wife had covered him with a blanket to reassure him after his first encounter with Angel Gabriel. In St. Francis' insistence on living a life of poverty, I see the Prophet's tawakkul, our total reliance upon God. He had married the richest woman in Mecca, but within a few years, they had given everything away. In Cardinal John of St. Paul's warning regarding the church and its wealth, I read a prediction about Islam's ulama-e su, the hypocrites. In James of Vitry's argument to goad the soldiers on to attack the Damietta, I hear the argument Al-Qaeda and Taliban make in order to justify attacks against their perceived enemies. I can go on making comparison, and Paul Moses makes me recall so much, but perhaps I should start winding up. It is strangely comforting, however, for me to know that the world has been through these crises before, and that there were conscientious people on both sides before who would think more humanely. Whether they succeeded in influencing the course of history or not is a different discussion. Paul Moses has bravely shot down myths that have grown around this story and St. Francis' character. And he has painstakingly recovered what had been eliminated carefully from the actual story by political expediency. I will conclude by telling another story that Muslims know very well, and which I'm quoting from Dr. Muqtadar Khan's blog. This is to celebrate both St. Francis and his sister in faith, St. Clare. The story goes, in 628 AD, a delegation from St. Catherine's monastery came to Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, and requested his protection. He responded by granting them a charter of rights. St. Catherine's monastery is located at the foot of Mount Sinai and is the world's oldest monastery. It possesses a huge collection of Christian manuscripts, second only to Vatican, and it's a World Heritage Site. It also boasts the oldest collection of Christian icons. It is a treasure house of Christian history that has remained safe for 1400 years under Muslim protection. This was the Prophet's promise to St. Catherine's monastery. This is a message. I'm quoting now. This is a message from Muhammad ibn Abdullah as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity. Near and far, we are with them. Verily I, the servants, the helpers, and my followers defend them, because Christians are my citizens, and by Allah, I hold out against anything that displeases them. No compulsion is to be on them. Neither are their judges to be removed from their jobs, nor their monks from their monasteries. No one is to destroy a house of their religion, to damage it, or to carry anything from it to the Muslim houses. Should anyone take any of these, he would spoil God's covenant and disobey his prophet. Verily, they are my allies and have my secure charter against all that they hate. No one is to force them to travel or to oblige them to fight. The Muslims are to fight for them. If a female Christian is married to a Muslim, it is not to take place without her approval. She is not to be prevented from visiting her church to pray. Their churches are to be respected. They are neither to be prevented from repairing them nor the sacredness of their covenants. No one of the nation, no one of the Ummah, Muslim nation, is to disobey the covenant till the last day, end of the world, unquote. This is how a bridge was built. Tolerance and respect was established for the people of the book. The covenant was established until doomsday, in fact, beyond doomsday, until the day of judgment, on which anyone who tries to alter, destroy, or revoke that promise will be accountable to Allah and His Prophet. This, as Dr. Khan points out, and I quote, is a charter without any duties. In 628 AD, it clearly protects the right to property, freedom of religion, freedom of work, and security of the person. Most educated Muslims know about this charter. Perhaps it will help to know more about these relationships that can foster trust and de-emphasize conflict. Let's hope that our warmongers everywhere come to their senses in a manner that our prophets Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Jesus, may peace be upon him, would approve of. Amen. That concludes my remarks, my few remarks, and it's my pleasure to introduce one of our students, Mariam Alam now. Mariam is a senior, a biology major. She is the president of Muslim Students Association at St. Francis College, and she's a budding poet. And one little good piece of information, she just got married about 2 minutes ago. So Mariam Alam.
Thank you for inviting me here to speak today. So first and foremost, I think it's important to recognize the great efforts of Mr. Paul Moses for taking the time to write this book from such an interesting perspective and in a time where I believe it has such significant relevance. Now, I have to admit that upon reading the title, The Crusades in Islam, I was quite unsure as to what to expect, as we all know that the Crusades hosted some of the most bloodiest battles in history. And in many accounts of these battles, we actually come across inevitable pinch of bias in historical literature, whether it was in favor of the Latin Catholic Christians or whether it was in favor of the Muslims. However, upon actually reading the book, I was truly enlightened by a different perspective that actually focused on the fundamental concept of peace in the midst of war, death, and tumult. And the underlying message for me that I was able to prize out from this excellently executed recount of the life of the respectable St. Francis of Assisi was that coexistence and peace is necessary. And from the way in which he preached his beliefs to the lifestyle in which he lived, everything that he stood for was peace. And as a Muslim reading this from a critical and analytical point of view, I saw many parallels, as Professor Afzal also mentioned, with what is taught in the Islamic faith. And the word Islam itself, meaning to submit or to surrender, also derives from the root word salam in Arabic, which translates to mean peace. And it is a faith that was revealed to an orphaned messenger, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. And like St. Francis, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stood for humbleness, peace, equity, justice, and also love. However, though the two were known for being morally upright and virtuous by nature, I think they were also both greeted by much hostility. Quoting from the book, as Mr. Moses also mentioned in his talk, this would not be the first time people took you for a fool. Unburden your conscience and fear God rather than men. Likewise, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when visiting a place in Saudi Arabia called Ta'if, preached the message of peace like St. Francis, and was greeted by ridicule and mockery by the people that resided there, being pelted by clods and rocks as he was wounded and covered in blood as he staggered outside of the city, and yet he still prayed to God to guide these people. So this is the morality that we see in these men who stood for peace in the midst of what I would say was greed for wealth and also greed for affluence. And really the take-home message that I got from reading this book was that war is not the answer. And in fact, war raises more questions than it does answers. And with that, I believe that understanding, forgiveness, and faith is really what should unite all hearts and not divide people. So now I leave you with the Muslim greetings of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you.
Miriam, how appropriate. Peace, shalom, salam. Peace for all.